Many Christians are claiming that the Hunger Games, and specifically Katniss, provide a Christian ethic in confronting the violence of our world. And what I want to do in this video is challenge that notion and say that if we really want to look at a Christian ethic that challenges the violence of our world, we should look not to Katniss, but to a woman of the Roman Empire who was thrown into an arena that looks very similar to the arena of the Hunger Games and chose to deal with it in a very different way than Katniss. The difference in these methods is the difference between the possibility of total annihilation in the future and a future that is based on the Christian ethics of love, compassion, and mercy. The Hunger Games is based on a universal human emotion, and that emotion is fear, specifically the fear of death. And this is why I think that the Hunger Games has captured our imagination so well, is because it speaks at a very profound level to this fear of death and where this fear of death could possibly lead us. Now, I want to mention that there's nothing necessarily wrong about the fear of death. It's natural to be afraid of death, but what becomes problematic is when we are run by the fear of death and we want to control our fear of death, because the way we control our fear of death is by putting somebody else in the place of death so that we can have an illusion of control over life and death. And we see this principle of being run by death, the fear of death, throughout the Hunger Games. So the Capitol is run by the fear of death as it threatens the districts with violence and death. And one of the ways it threatens the districts with violence and death is through the Hunger Games itself. So here the Capitol forces 24 tributes, teenagers, to go into an arena where they themselves have to fight one another to the death. And they end up doing this. They end up being run themselves by the fear of death, by making one another go through death so that they themselves might not have to. And you see at the end of the first book that maybe Katniss has overcome her fear of death as she threatens to commit suicide. But in this threat to commit suicide, we see that Katniss is still run by the fear of death because she is seeking to manipulate the Capitol through violence to her own body. Katniss is very clever. She's more clever than the Capitol. She knows that the Capitol will not allow her to commit suicide because it wants a winner. But Katniss uses violence and the threat of her own death in order to manipulate the Capitol. Here Katniss shows that she is still run by death. Now, where does this fear of death lead us? In the next two books in the Hunger Games series, we see that it could eventually lead us to annihilation, an end of the world like scenario. And I think this is the positive message of the Hunger Games, is that if you allow yourself to be run by the fear of death, violence will go out of control and it will lead to an end of the world like scenario. That, I think, is a good message, but an even better message is an alternative. And I would like to explore that alternative with you through a historical example of a young Roman woman named Perpetua. Perpetua was born into the Roman Empire in the late 180s. And Rome during this time was also run by the fear of death, and it looked a lot like the Capitol of the Hunger Games. It had its own arena where it would force people to fight one another to the death. And here we see that the Roman Empire was run by its own fear of death and tried to control it by forcing others to go through death so that it could have a sense of control. And Perpetua was actually a Roman pagan who converted to Christianity. And around the year 200, there was an emperor of Rome who forbid all Roman citizens from converting to Christianity because he was afraid of Christianity. He was afraid that Christianity would subvert the Roman Empire, because these early Christians would go around saying, Jesus is Lord, which meant that the emperor was not Lord. And what the argument here was, there are two ways of life, the way of Jesus and the way of the emperor. The way of Jesus was not run by the fear of death. You see this when Jesus goes to the cross and doesn't seek to give death back to those who were killing him, but actually seeks to forgive them. This is a different way of life that has nothing to do with the fear of death, but everything to do with creating a new community that is based on love, compassion, and forgiveness. That's one way of life. The other way of life is the way of the Roman Empire, which is based on trying to control violence by making others go through it. So Perpetua chooses the way of Jesus, and she knows that this is risky because in this choice, she is subverting the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire does, in fact, make her go into the arena. But before she goes there, she has this vision where she sees this ladder, and at the top of the ladder is heaven. But at the bottom of the ladder is a dragon, which symbolizes death. And in this vision, Perpetua sees herself stepping on the dragon. She steps on death and climbs up the ladder up to heaven. And here she sees that she will conquer her fear of death. And in fact, she goes into the arena, and that is where she ends up dying. And you might think that here Perpetua is trying to escape the violence of the world, but in fact that's not what she's doing at all. What she's doing is subverting the Roman Empire through nonviolence, through love, through compassion, that even embraces those who are run by the fear of death and seek to kill us. So Perpetua is not run at all by the fear of death. In fact, she overcomes it. And in her witness, she shows the world a different way of life. So here I think that we have these two models. We have Katniss, who is run by the fear of death. And it's true that at the end of the last book, she rejects all of this violence and goes off and lives by herself and her husband. But she doesn't challenge this way of being run by the fear of death. She just goes away from it. And then you have the model of Perpetua, who goes into the violence of the world in order to show it a different way of life, in order to say you don't have to be run by this fear. You can live in the ways of love, compassion, and mercy. Those are our two models, and I think that the model of Perpetua shows us the hope for a better world.